So I'm just going to begin. I think I'm onto something. I have a personality where if I think I'm onto something, I can't stop thinking about it. And I have to walk you through what I've come to just know as the equation, because it accounts for everything that has been produced in my life that is meaningful. It's a bold statement. Everything from my childhood to present day, I can trace back to this, including this place and space that we're standing in, to everything that I'm doing currently in life, has been informed by this equation. And as I begin to talk about it, I only want you to focus on the far right for now, which is that C. And that C stands for culture. So I'm going to Tarantino this talk a little bit. I'm going to go backwards and forwards and go backwards and forwards. And in the end, I promise it will all make sense. So first things first. I went on a listening tour in 2012 into 2013. I didn't call it that then, but that's exactly what it was. This listening tour was loosely put together with a small framework of 33 questions that I knew had to be answered. I was trained to be a Navy SEAL for 2.5 years, sustained a spine injury, and I was out. I was the 16th man in my family to serve. I felt like I let a lot of people down, and I had to figure out a problem that I had recognized inside of the special operations community, which was what happens to this community when they transition out of service. Well, what I heard on this listening tour was remarkable. I'm not that smart. I lined up 200 interviews. I could have stopped after 30, but I didn't believe in my own intuition just yet. And what I heard was the same thing over and over again. You name it, I went to 7 states over 6 months and interviewed over 200 operators. And if you look outside in that front lobby, you'll notice booths, you'll notice a table, you'll notice a bar, because I met with them in Panera and Starbucks booths. I met with them and broke bread over tables, and I sat in bars, of course, and had many deep and long conversations about a not so seamless transition. What I heard was something remarkably simple, but profound. What I heard was something simple to say, very difficult to do. What I heard was, Joe, I just want to be part of a great team. I want to follow a great leader. And I want to be part of a culture that's going to become something much bigger than myself. Easy to say, very difficult to do. Now, what that turned into was the beginnings of something that I now call TLC. And I hope you all went to a place when I said that, because TLC to most means tender loving care. And I hope you think of it that way. But for right now, we're going to look at it in the context of teams, leadership, and culture. That got me curious because for 6 months I heard the same story over and over again from hundreds of operators who have been all over the world, who have seen different cultures, who have met people, who have been statesmen, diplomats, war fighters, you name it. And when they went to transition, it wasn't what you would have expected. But then the more stories you heard, it's exactly what you knew it was. They just want to be part of something great. Again, they've already had their dream job. How do they find what's next? Well, with that being said, I obviously had a perfect mixture of wanting to serve, and my own vulnerabilities and insecurities at the time made like the perfect cocktail and the perfect chip on my shoulder to go out with a vengeance and try to figure out what is going on the employer side. And that's the other half of the bridge. It's not just up to this community to be educated, it's up to the employer community as well to also be educated. Well, it was funny because when I went out to the employer community, I heard a similar thing. I learned how to stalk and find and target CEOs all over the country, and I interviewed 151 Fortune 500 CEOs over the next 6 months. And what they told me caught me by surprise. When I asked them about their successes and I asked them about their failures, they told me a version of the same story. Mr. and Mrs. CEO, tell me about the successes of this company. Well, we have unbelievable teams. We have leaders at this company that are profound. And we have a culture that people just feel like they belong. Okay. So what I began to do is a bit of a matching process. It's like, all right, I have this community over here that are some of the most high performers in the world, argued by pretty much no one. And then over here, you have some of the top employers and CEOs in the world talking about their organization in a very similar way. And then I started to go deep into the iceberg of the company. And going from the CEO on down to the VP, on down to the director, on down to the managers, on down to the associates, whatever the titles were. And I noticed that something else started to come into question. When I would ask them questions about the company, they would start to talk about the teams, but they would talk about vision, they would talk about mission, they would talk about values. And the deeper I went into the organization, I recognized that it became, of course, about teams, leaders, and cultures, but they were quite explicit about what drew them to the organization. The vision of the company, the mission of what they're executing on day to day, and the values of this organization is what drew me closer. So how did I begin to cut out different employers? I started to build this rubric in my head on how to see how aligned the CEO was with the rest of the organization, up, down, and all around. And the ones who were the CEO was telling me the same thing as the front desk receptionist. The ones that were celebrating 55-year work anniversaries for Jill, who had been there from the time she was until the time she was COO of the company, and now taking a volunteer role to care and nurture for her people. All the organizations that were in that top tier of employer, they all thought, acted, communicated the exact same way. And I started to notice a pattern very quickly. When I transitioned from one organization and had to answer the question, what's next for myself, I started to get into a very dark place because I'm leaving a job that I love, and I had to find what was next for me. I went back to what I knew, and what I knew was a listening tour. And now I officially called it that. And I pulled on this experience of learning from not just Navy SEALs, but Army Rangers and Marine Raiders, and folks from the Olympic community, the professional athlete community. And they all said, remarkably, the exact same thing. We shouldn't be surprised, like no one in this country, this is timely to talk about this, as the Olympics are going on, no one asks what happens to Olympians after the Olympics. Just as no one asks what happens to SEALs after they've been Navy SEALs. Neither community just rides off into the sunset and has this like grand kind of retiring situation. These are folks that belonged deeply to something during the most impressionable professional years of their life, and in some cases, since they could barely walk, practicing their sport and their craft and their trade. But yet they all communicated the same way. Olympians, I just want another team to be a part of and to belong to. I just want to follow a leader who believes in me, and I want to find a culture that's much bigger than myself, and to work and strive towards something that's much bigger than me. So all these words were on a whiteboard, and I started to look at them throughout my own transition of figuring out what was next for me. And all of a sudden, I kept seeing the same variables all over this. And I went back to my interviews and I studied them and I analyzed them and I picked words out and I jumbled them together and I figured out the frequency of these words and how often companies use them, and I became like this strange person working out of a shed. And for those of you that know me well enough, you may have like been inside of this shed to see like what was happening in my life, and you would think that there was something wrong with me. But what was wrong with me was that I thought I was onto something. And as much as we want to believe that we're onto something, it's others that tell us whether we're really onto anything at all. And so we have to start to test, and we have to start to get it out to the community we mean to serve. So in my own transition, I picked two groups of folks. And I focused on those two groups of folks for the next year. And during that year, from February of 2019 to February of 2020, pay attention to that timeline, I went on my next official listening tour. And the two buckets of folks I decided to interview this time, one, entrepreneurs, 50 of them, all venture-backed by Silicon Valley funds, all between the seed and A rounds of financing. Those are going to be specific, are important for you to remember. The second group were VCs, some of the world's top investors over the next 6 months. And I sat in front of this community, and I'll be damned. When I asked the entrepreneurs, tell me about all your successes and tell me about all your failures, they said, well, I mean, all the successes are, I have to give it to the teams. The leadership that we've been able to bring on board from the beginning to where we are now is taking the company in a totally new direction. And we've been focusing on culture from the earliest stages of the business. Interesting. Now, mind you, we got to real later on. The 20-minute block that we had, in the calendar turned into 5 hours. Cocktails, drinks, outside, talking, walking up and down Main Street and University Avenue, and from Palo Alto to Menlo Park to back to LA to San Diego and all over the country, talking to these folks. And over that 6-month period, they all told me a version of the exact same thing, which told me that's a community I want to now work with, for sure. They emulate so much from the highest performers in the world. The right ones emulate so much from the highest performers in the world. They're obsessed. And they're obsessed with building great teams. They're obsessed with building great leadership. And most importantly, they want a culture that's going to make a difference in the world. On the investor side, to no surprise, what makes a great investment? At the seed stage, okay? Companies are just starting. That stage is what it means and represents, right? We're trying to plant a seed and we're going to see if it works and if it sticks. There's one major variable that you can look at the earliest stage: the teams, the leadership, the propensity of the leaders, and the culture they hope to create and bring into the world. And I heard the exact same thing from the VCs. This is what I look to invest in. Now, this is what caught my attention. When I went deeper into that and asked them deeper questions to the psychology of teams, the psychology of leaders, and most importantly, how do you quantify culture as an investor at the seed stage? I received a lot of question marks. A lot of question marks. And I could tell that they didn't necessarily know or can't point to any one given thing. And so the response was, well, culture is very hard to quantify. And going in as a VC, I had no venture background. I had no investments to date. I had never invested in a company before. I had no background in finance. I dropped out of accounting and stats my first year in undergrad. It wasn't for me. But what I did become obsessed about is quantifying culture. And if everybody's talking about this, from the highest performers in the world to venture investors who are seeding companies that will change our world, I needed to figure out how to quantify culture. And I did it looking backwards. So to the right, you'll notice the first listening tour informed the second, or informed the right side of this equation, and the second listening tour confirmed it. What I needed to do with startups or starting up organizations is figure out a way to understand and quantify their culture, and it has to do with absolute alignment, up, down, and all around, taking lessons I learned from the first listening tour and applying it into venture capital. How clear is the vision of the founder? What is the world they hope to create and build alongside others? How clear is the whole organization at that point in time on that vision? There's a metric we can measure. Mission. Why are we getting out of bed every single day to do this? Most importantly, does everyone else in the organization believe in that cause and believe in that mission to get out of work, to get out of bed every single day, put their feet on the ground to execute on that mission? And lastly, the values. How do you think, act, and feel and communicate into the world based on a very specific set of values? Created a rubric for that, to ask questions around the founder's values, and then ask the rest of the organization, can you tell me what the values are of the organization and where they came from? When I would put all these people into a room and have these conversations, it was remarkable that 9 out of 10 companies were not aligned. Meaning the person that was just hired has no idea and can't talk about, in absolute clear terms, the world they hope to create. In absolute clear terms, the mission on why they're getting out of bed, the deeper mission with the anecdote, the narrative, the story about why they're coming to work every single day, and the depth that goes into creating a mission. The value set, where does it stem from? I'll use a friend of mine's definition of team is when there are two or more people working towards a common goal or objective. A friend of all of ours, his name is Rich Davini. And I like that because it's simple, and it goes to show you that any one founder that walks into this scenario, they have a vision, mission, value set inside of themselves. Coming into building this business, that's the beginning of the vision, mission, value of the company. The moment you bring on one teammate, now we're a team. Now you have to co-create, co-author the company's vision, mission, and values together. As people come on board, they need to know where this is coming from. These are not just words on a wall or a piece of paper. And I can tell you that the more I work with, whether it's Fortune companies or whether it's startups, I can tell you about a company's culture by how they take people into an organization and how they let people go of an organization. Tells me about everything in between. Everything, how you treat people in and how you treat people out. That translates very, very well into starting up organizations, because we've all heard that phrase, hire slow, fire fast, right? Whether it's right or wrong, we don't know. But I do know this, no one has a shot of doing anything extraordinary if they're not aligned as to where the vision, mission, values come. When I went deeper into the founder and the founding team, I noticed that they had these sayings that seemed certain to both work and life as it pertains to them. Where they came up with these. A lot of times, like for instance, my father, a principle he didn't call it that, but it's what it is. It's universally true in both work and life. Leave something better than when you found it. My mother, very Italian, would always say, growing up, take responsibility for your actions. A lot of us call that extreme ownership now, or take ownership, or be accountable, right? But these are principles that are always true in both work and life. And I hear this in founders over and over again. They have these sayings and phrases that they're pulling from somewhere. It's the best way to scale who they are, because it's where they're coming from. And it's stemming from something very deep, which then comes to ethos. Ethos is character of a company. And when I think of ethos, a lot of us has talked about stoicism, we've talked about stoic philosophy. When we talk about character and integrity of an organization, it's amazing how when you go to an About Us page on a website, you leave knowing nothing about them. And I see by the laughs and the smiles and the head nods, everyone has experienced that before. It's the one great opportunity that you have to tell the world what you're working on. And so many folks do not pay attention. About us. About us. And you leave knowing nothing about them. What a missed opportunity. But the ones who do, the 1 out of 10, not the 9 out of 10, but the 1 out of 10 that I interviewed of those 50 startups, there's some interesting statistics now 2 years later looking longitudinally. And I picked 2 or 3 specific statistics to talk about, or to bring up, I should say, when you're not aligned according to this. So let's go through this. For the companies that were aligned that I interviewed in 2019, from vision, mission, values, principles, and ethos multiplied by the teams and the leadership behaviors that were happening on a day-to-day, and then I could quantify their culture and their alignment. 1 out of 10 were aligned according to that. And what I found was that the 1 out of 10 that were aligned accounted now 2 years later for over 90% of the revenue earned by all 50 companies 2 years later from the seed to C. So that to me was remarkable. Remarkable. And now it's starting to validate the questions that I have in my head, that something is to folks that are aligned according to this equation. And the other one that really stuck with me is they raised 5 times the capital than the other folks who were not aligned. We heard someone in the audience earlier ask a question about storytelling and how important that is. Stories are how cultures persist. I learned that from working with the SEAL community and Olympians. Let's face it, war fighters and warriors in general have carried storytelling on for ages. It's how they communicate. It's how they know where they come from. founders are very similar to that, where they share in commiserating, they share in the pain and the suffering that it takes to build something great. So the reason why I chose to talk about this is there is a way to quantify culture. And this equation continues to be refined and built in a new direction with more inputs. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how we can talk about this in our everyday lives, from our homes to our work to companies, because we have to ask ourselves, if there's a lot of founders in the room, if we were to pull you all out of your organization and put all of your executives, your co-founders, and your teammates in separate rooms and say, what's the vision of this company? What's the mission of this company? What are the values of this company and where do they come from? Tell me about the principles that you all have. Tell me about the ethos. What makes it character? What makes this place filled with character and integrity? And then talk about the teams, the leadership, and the culture. And will everyone tell me the same thing? That's true alignment. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. I appreciate you.